Well, welcome everybody. It's nice to see such a crowd. If you're here from the Key West Maritime Historical Society, welcome. This is part of our lecture series, but it's also a library program via the Florida Keys History Center, which I'll talk about in a minute. Tonight's subject will be German U-boats in the Florida Keys, a forgotten menace. But let me talk a little bit about who I am and what I do. Nick, can you cut the lights, please? Yeah. Thank you. Perfect. My name is Corey Malcolm. I am the lead historian for the Florida Keys History Center. We are the office in the back of the library there. We're sort of a quasi-sixth branch of the Monroe County library system, and we are tasked with the mission, as you can see up there, to explore, preserve, promote, and make accessible the history of Monroe County, Florida. And we do that in a number of ways. We maintain an archive full of documents and photographs and all relating to the history of the Florida Keys. And we do a lot of outreach, you know, like what I'm doing now. We also do This Day in Keys History, which is a long-running column that runs in the newspaper, and it is available on all of our social media accounts. So please, if you don't, follow Florida Keys History Center on Facebook, Instagram, Threads, X, any of those, and you can get This Day in Keys History right there. I also write a periodic column called Island Chronicles. I know Nan Klingener back here has a clipboard. You can sign up. You can have Island Chronicles delivered directly to your email account, and also any newsletters and updates and that sort of thing as well. But Island Chronicles takes a look at some of the maybe lesser known aspects of Keys history, so it's a pretty fun read. And also, you know, if people just have general questions about history, they come in our office, they ask, and we help them find answers. So come back, see me, see my colleagues, Brianna Sowers and Richard Richardson, and we will help you however is needed to explore Florida Keys history. Tonight's subject, German U-boats in the Florida Keys, a forgotten menace. I had a couple of motivations for doing this talk. One, my predecessor, Tom Hambright, was very interested in this subject, and he kind of laid a lot of the groundwork for this, but I wanted to build on what Tom had done and really flesh out the subject. And also, a couple of years ago, I was part of a TV program, if any of you have ever seen Expeditions Unknown. They did an episode called Sharks versus Nazis in Paradise, and it was ostensibly about this, but I gotta say it was sort of a bit of fluff, you know. So, and I thought the subject deserved a much more detailed and serious treatment. So anyway, here we are. It was motivation to put this talk together. So let me start with the basics. You know, what are U-boats? What does that term mean? Well, it comes from the German Unterseeboot, which really just means an undersea boat, which is a submarine. All right, so this is about German submarines. U-boats are submarines. And upon entry of the U.S. into World War II, Nazi Germany began to attack shipping on the western side of the Atlantic with these submarines. And over the course of the war, nearly 600 vessels were sunk in U.S. waters, with over 5,000 mariners killed. One historian has termed it the Atlantic's Pearl Harbor. But the second part of the title, A Forgotten Menace, why is that all that terror forgotten? Well, that is a direct result of our government had what was called the Office of Censorship during World War II. And the Office of Censorship worked hand in hand with the press to keep some of these stories sort of on the down low. They didn't really want it to get out there to everybody for a couple of reasons. A, didn't want the Germans to know how successful their attacks had been, and B, you wanted to keep stateside morale high. You didn't want people to think that, oh my gosh, we're under attack, and have people in a panic. So what that did was basically never allowed these stories to take root into public consciousness, and they haven't persisted through time because people just never really knew about them, all right? What I'm going to talk about tonight is some of the general history, but really focus on what happened here in the Florida Keys during World War II. So, let's start at the beginning of the German submarine history. Germany was really the last major European navy to adopt submarines technology. And here we see their first submarine, the SMU-1, which was launched in December of 1906. Now, the Germans, once they got going, they really ramped up their submarine production, and by the start of World War I in 1914, they had 20 combat-ready U-boats. And their U-boats were more sophisticated than any other country's submarines, and they had a longer range and really were top-tier craft. Now they began using them in the war, and their first attacks were on British military craft. But a year later, in 1915, they widened their scope, and they declared unrestricted submarine warfare. And basically, any ship, particularly ships under an enemy flag, were subject to attack. And in 1915, the Germans attacked the passenger steamer Lusitania and took with it nearly 1,300 people. That caused an outrage around the globe. It nearly drew the United States into the war. It was just such a shocking, horrific act. And Germany backed off of their policy. They said, okay, we can't just start, just blasting any ship. So they held back for a while, kept the U.S. out of the war, but then they reverted, and they went back to that policy, that unrestricted submarine warfare, and with that, the United States entered the war. And that all happened in 1917. By May of 1918, we see the first German U-boat arrive in American waters. It made a 12,000-mile patrol to the U.S. coast and back. And during that time, it sank 13 ships, laid mines in American ports, and severed a couple of telegraph cables. So, inflicted a lot of damage, and the Germans remembered that capability. Now, at the end of the war, the Treaty of Versailles required that all that Germany surrender all of its U-boats and could build no more. Well, some of those U-boats were divvied up, and some were toured around. And this, from what I can gather, was the first German U-boat to arrive in Key West. And this happened in 1919. It was a captured German U-boat UB-88, and it was on a victory loan drive. And so it toured the United States and would stop in various ports. The local residents could then tour the vessel, and the purpose was to raise money for the victory loan drive and help pay off the government's huge war debt. Now, Adolf Hitler, when he took power in Germany, he was very resentful of the Treaty of Versailles and really did not want to abide by its terms. And in 1935, he repudiated that peace pact, and he started building the first Third Reich U-boats. And we see in that year, the U-1 was built, and that's this vessel right here. That then began the buildup of a U-boat fleet once again. And we see by the start of the war in 1939, they had a very substantial fleet, and once again, these were top-tier craft. And in September of 1939, we see the Germans entering the war and using very quickly these U-boats to stop supplies from entering Britain. They wanted to strangle Britain and keep them from getting fuel, keep them from getting other supplies, and really had a devastating attack, what was called the Battle of the Atlantic. And all these ships going into Britain were open season for the Germans. Now you can see on the map on the right, the blue dots were all vessels sunk by the U-boats, and the red dots were U-boats that were sunk by the Allies. So if you count them up, you can see the skew was very heavily in Germany's favor. Now they wound up calling this the happy time. Once Germany took over France, they built U-boat ports right there in what's called Lorient on the northwest corner of France. And from that point on, they could very easily send U-boats out, attack these ships without a whole lot of resistance, and really cause a lot of damage. Now the Allies caught on quickly and found out that, okay, if we organize convoys by putting merchant ships sailing together under a military escort, that worked pretty well against resisting U-boat attacks. And part of that system, we do have a local connection. If any of you recognize this vessel here, that is the cutter Ingham that we have tied up here at the Truman waterfront. So it served in World War II. It was under Navy control and served in the Battle of the Atlantic, and is actually credited for sinking a U-boat in 1943. So Ingham has a pretty proud history in this Battle of the Atlantic against the U-boats. Now, in December of 1941, of course, the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor. The United States entered the war, and then 4 days after Pearl Harbor, Germany declared war on the United States. And so World War II really began in earnest for the U.S. We see the first U-boat attacks on the East Coast just weeks later in January of 1942. Now the Germans called this Operation Paukenschlag, which means drumbeat. And they would soon dub it the second happy time, because again, they were sending these ships, these U-boats out from France across the Atlantic, and they met very, very little resistance when they got here. So for them, it was just a great time for their military. In February of 1942, we see the first attacks off Florida. Here you can see a telegram, and it illustrates what was a big problem. You can see it says, so we see tankers being blown up off the Florida coast, and it says here, it's reasonable to assume the submarine was aided by the lights of the amusement concessions. And what that means is that the Germans would put their targets between the shore and themselves, and then as they steamed by, they could see from the lights on shore the silhouette of the target, even if it was blacked out. And so in this case, they used the amusement parks off of Jacksonville, which were all lit up. People didn't stop going to the parks, even though we were under attack. And they would use the lights from those to frame their targets and then torpedo them. So this problem, once it was realized, they started implementing blackouts. Now, Key West also in February of 1942 became the headquarters of what was called the Gulf Sea Frontier. It was organized on February 6th, and it was designed to control this space right here. This is what the Gulf Sea Frontier, and you can see it extended from the Florida-Georgia border out into the northern Bahamas, to western Cuba, around below Cuba to the Yucatan, and then covered the entirety of the Gulf of Mexico, a very large territory that was administered right here out of Key West for a number of months. And what they would do is they would keep track of all the ship traffic within that zone and all of the assets that they had available to monitor those ships. So you can see the red are various vessels in which direction they're sailing, and then various planes that they had available, or Navy vessels that they had available. I mean, you can see their coverage was not so great on this particular day. A lot of ships out there, not too many able to keep an eye on them. And this was meant to, guard against the U-boats. Now, some of the weaponry that they used against U-boats, primarily depth charges. These were big drum-shaped bombs, basically, that they would drop into the water when they detected a U-boat. The depth charge had you could adjust it to explode at certain depths. So you could adjust the dial for the depth charge to explode at 30 feet, or you could adjust it to explode at 300 feet. So it had a pressure sensor, and when that sensor was triggered, the depth charge would explode and hopefully damage the U-boat. They also had deck guns on board, just to blast away at the U-boats. Planes could drop depth bombs, which also, again, would explode at depth. And again, the most effective tool against the U-boats was the convoy system. Much as had been used in the Atlantic off Britain, they wound up adapting that down here, and that was very effective against U-boat attacks, where you put merchant ships together with Navy vessels. And then there were mines, and those were used extensively here. Now we see these mines, they would drop them off a vessel. They had a sort of a mooring weight that would sink to the bottom, and then the mine would be suspended in the water column, and they had these little antennas coming off the mines. You can see those protruding out. And if a ship bumped those little antennas, what it did is it would bend them, and that would then cause either an electrical reaction or a chemical reaction, and that would then detonate the device. So ship bumps into that, bends the little protrusions, and the mine explodes. Well, in Key West, north of Key West, they laid in April of 1942 3,640 mines, and they were laid in 3 areas to the west and north of Smith Shoal. So you see right here, this little shoal right there, that is Smith Shoal, and then they put north of there in an arc a whole bunch of mines, and then south of there. And the idea was to make it so enemy vessels and U-boats could not approach Key West from the north. And that then they used the reefs and the shoals as natural protection, but by making the north side of the island impenetrable, they could then gather these convoys in Key West Harbor safely and then exit Key West via the reef. So that was the idea. It was a pretty sound plan, and it worked, except it didn't work as intended. On April 26, 1942, we see the first victim. Let me go back. You can see this is the passage through the minefield into the Northwest Channel so you could get to Key West. So anybody approaching from the north or west had to come through this little channel, very narrow. And if you drifted out of that, you hit a mine and you exploded. And of course, that happened. So we see on April 26, 1942, the U.S. destroyer Sturdivant hits 2 mines, explodes, and sinks. Just a couple weeks later, the steamer Gunvor does the same thing, hits a mine. 4 days later, the Bosilka does the same, and then on beginning of July, the Edward Luckenbach is a victim of the minefield. So in quick succession, we have vessels sunk by the Key West minefield, and it really was a tragedy. I mean, these vessels were never meant to be sunk, but it's all via friendly fire, so to speak. We have a situation up the Keys, off Key Largo, where the 360-foot steam freighter Benwood, sailing from Tampa with a cargo of phosphate, was running at night without lights. All right, so they would blacken out the ship at night so the U-boats couldn't see them. So it's running along in the dark, and coming the other way is the 528-foot tanker Robert C. Tuttle, also unlit. And the vessels signaled, but they misinterpreted each other's signals, and they wound up on a collision course off of Key Largo. The Benwood's bow plowed into the Tuttle, badly damaging the Benwood itself, and it sank in half an hour in 25 to 45 feet of water between French Reef and Dixie Shoals. It sits there today. It's one of the more popular dive sites off Key Largo. It's historically interesting, but there's also been a lot of natural growth on the wreck and in and around the area. So very, very popular. You can access it just by snorkeling, or you can dive on it. So this victim of World War II is now a very popular dive site. In May of 1942, we see the first entry into the Gulf of Mexico by a U-boat, the U-507. And it was the first of 24 U-boats to do that. The Germans learned that their subs could go a lot further than they initially thought, especially with the aid of special refueling tankers. So they had these U-boat tanker vessels that they called milk cows. And those milk cows would refuel the U-boats at sea. All right, so they would rendezvous, they would communicate, they would rendezvous, and the U-boats could refuel, and it gave them a much, much longer range than they had initially, and allowed them to penetrate deeply into the Gulf. So their goal in penetrating the Gulf was really to sink tankers. It was to destroy that fuel pipeline system that was aiding Britain and also aiding the United States at this point. So, some interesting facts, and it gives you some perspective on the U-boats about their size and what they could do. The U-507 had a captain, Harold Schacht, and 52 men. It was about 250 feet long, 22 feet wide, carried 22 torpedoes. And that's an important point because they had to use these torpedoes sparingly. They only had so many, and if you're going on a long cruise, you want to sink as many ships as you can, but you can't just shoot off these torpedoes willy-nilly. You got to conserve them, use them very strategically. They also did have 2 deck guns, a 4.1-inch gun, and 2 37-millimeter anti-aircraft guns. They could dive as deep as 750 feet. And interestingly, they didn't really have a long time underwater. You can see here, 63-mile underwater range, cruising at 4 knots. So that's not it's a long distance, but they didn't cross the ocean underwater, all right? Most of their time was spent at the surface. Here you can see they had a 13,400-mile range cruising at the surface. And that's really where they spent most of their time and from where they made their attacks generally. So U-boats could go underwater. That was mostly a defensive mechanism, all right? To go down, hide, and they hopefully wouldn't be bombed that way. Now we see the U-507 come in at the very, very beginning of May. May 1st, enters the Florida Straits more or less, comes to the north coast of Cuba, very quickly spies a freighter, small freighter steaming along the north coast of Cuba right here, decides to sink it. They didn't sink it with a torpedo, they sank it with gunfire, and down it went. And then they cruised along the north coast of Cuba, attacked other ships along the way. Those attacks were unsuccessful, but I'm sure it caused alarm. And then they steamed past the lower keys here. And Haroshat wrote in his log as he passed the keys that all of the navigational lights and lighthouses were lit, to quote him, as if in peacetime. So people knew that U-boats were out there, but they just really weren't taking that defensive action that they should have. Then he made some attacks and went on to the mouth of the Mississippi. We see on May 3rd, probably almost certainly prompted by the U-507 being in the area and having attacked some of those ships, Key West is suddenly ordered to undergo a blackout. And so they black out Key West, but unfortunately, a fire broke out at the same time and kind of negated the effects of the blackout. But as you can see, Navy officials offered no explanation for the blackout, and it was the first ordered there without prior warning. So again, they kind of didn't tell people why, but they just said, all right, blackout time. And almost certainly from the U-507. All right, so the U-507's first victim is attacked just northwest of the Dry Tortugas on May 4th at 5:42 p.m., 80 miles west of the Tortugas. The U-507 comes upon the American tanker Norlindo, carrying 4,800 barrels of fuel oil. One torpedo was fired at Norlindo, which found its target, and the vessel went down in minutes. 5 men were killed in the attack, and 23 were forced into life rafts. The U-507 approached, and Haroshat gave the men in the lifeboat cigarettes, crackers, and lime juice. And he told them, "I hope you get to shore okay. I'm sorry, but we can't help you any further." And left the men in the lifeboats and continued on the cruise. On May 5th, in the early morning, about 6 hours after attacking the Norlindo, they came across the Munger T. Ball, 1:30 in the morning. Munger T. Ball was a 5,100 tanker that was fully loaded with gasoline, sailing from Port Arthur to Virginia. And it was unescorted, and it gave no evasive maneuvers as the U-507 approached. They had no idea the U-boat was out there. One torpedo was fired, and the Munger T-ball exploded into flames. Again, Schacht wrote in his logbook, it resulted in a mushroom cloud of smoke. The ship was surrounded by burning gasoline, and that prevented the escape of most of the crew of the Munger T-ball. And of the 41 men on board, 37 of them died. Now, the Munger T-ball was a pretty spectacular explosion, and it was seen by another tanker that was out there in the Gulf, and the Joseph M. Cudahy. And the captain of the Cudahy sent out a radio alarm saying that he had seen a vessel attacked, and it was most likely by a U-boat. And he announced that he was 9 miles away from the incident and roughly 65 miles northwest of the Tortugas. Well, that wasn't a very smart move, because Harold Schacht was listening on board the U-507, and he said, okay, there's another one out here. So he began searching, and he went to where the captain of the Cudahy said his vessel was. They found them. And by this time, the Cudahy knew that they were being tracked. And so they began evasive maneuvers, zigzagging, trying to throw off any torpedoes that might be fired at them. And it worked initially. The first torpedo fired by the U-507 missed. But at 4:24 a.m., a second torpedo was fired from closer range, and it struck. And Schacht again wrote in his logbook, hit center, steamer exploded, and it immediately burst into flames forward and aft. The Cudahy wound up remaining afloat for a few days after being struck, and it was eventually sunk on purpose by the U.S. Navy on May 9th. There you see a scenario of the Cudahy. Now, the survivors of these vessels, and really all vessels that were sunk generally in the Key West area, were brought to Key West. And, of course, we had the hospital facilities here, and they could be treated and taken care of, and then, reunited later with their families. It's interesting, we're talking about the Office of Censorship. Well, you can see the effects of that in all of these captions. They never really say where these attacks happened. Very rarely do they mention the name of the vessel that was attacked. So people would know that something bad had happened, but they didn't know exactly where or how bad it was. A few days after the attack on the Cudahy, May 14th, we see the Potrero del Llano sunk off of Fowey Rocks in the far upper Keys. It was so close to Miami that people in their office buildings could take pictures of the flames and the column of smoke. The Potrero del Llano was a Mexican vessel, and this attack actually drew Mexico into the war. In June of 1942, about a month later, we see the first sinking of a German U-boat in Keys waters. On June 1st, 1942, the U-157 departed France with the goal of reaching the Mississippi River. On June 10th, off the north coast of Cuba, as they steamed towards their intended location, they spied a tanker, the 6,400-ton tanker Hagen, and torpedoed and sank it off, like I say, off the north coast of Cuba. That alerted the Gulf Sea frontier to the presence of the U-157, and they ordered that the submarine be hunted and destroyed. An Army Air Force B-18 out of Key West spotted the sub on June 11th, dropped 4 depth bombs, but they missed. And the U-157 continued its cruise, but it was seen a few hours later by a Pan Am plane flying between Miami and Havana. And the pilot called in the location when he saw the U-boat, and the Gulf Sea Frontier ordered 14 anti-submarine warfare vessels to that area, including the U.S. Coast Guard cutter Thetis. On June 13th at 4 p.m., as these vessels are all searching for the U-boat, the Thetis' sound man picked up a strong contact. Now, these boats were using sonar. They would send out sound waves and measure the reflections. And on the Thetis, the sound man said, "We're really close to something underwater here." And the captain ordered that 7 charges be dropped from the racks at the stern in 5-second intervals and 2 more off the bow. Those were all set to explode at between 200 and 300 feet. And after they exploded, a mixture of air, oil, and debris roiled to the surface. And in that mix of debris were leather pants, wood planking, and a grease tube reading "Made in Dusseldorf." So the Thetis got the kill, sank the U-157, the first submarine casualty of Germany's Gulf and Caribbean campaign. And you can see that happen more or less off the south, directly south of the Marquesas Keys. It's probably in between 2,000 and 3,000 feet of water. We, just days later, despite the sinking of the U-157, just a couple days later, 3 days later, we see another attack. This time on the SS Managua, a 2,200-ton Nicaraguan merchant steamer, which was torpedoed at 4 in the morning by the U-boat number 67. All hands on board the Managua made it into lifeboats. They were stopped by the captain of the U-67 and grilled about what their vessel's mission was, what cargo they had carried, and what the nationality of the vessel was. They were then let go. The lifeboats from that point drifted in different directions. One made it to Cuba, and another wound up on Pigeon Key. The attacks kept coming. A month later, the Pennsylvania Sun was attacked west, basically west-southwest of Key West here. The Pennsylvania Sun was steaming unescorted from Texas to Ireland with 107,000 barrels of fuel oil. It was torpedoed by the U-571 125 miles from Key West, and it was immediately engulfed in flames. 2 men on board were killed, but 57 survived and were eventually taken to Key West. Interestingly, the Pennsylvania Sun remained afloat. Its flames subsided and were eventually extinguished, and the Pennsylvania Sun was then towed here to Key West for temporary repairs. The bodies were taken off the ship, and then once it was able to be towed, it was taken up north, fully repaired, and stayed in service for another 20 years. So a pretty remarkable tale for the Pennsylvania Sun. Now, we talk about, the Navy efforts to stop, intervene on these U-boats, but there was also a pretty sizable civilian effort. The locals were called into action as well. And you see that happening in various ways. There were civilian air patrols. These are just people that had an airplane, and they would volunteer their services to the government. And they would go out and they would fly and monitor the Florida Straits or the Gulf of Mexico and report any submarines that they sighted to the authorities. You also had the Ground Observation Corps. This is a tower. This is called the George Marshall Observation Tower. It is at mile marker 91, or was at mile marker 91 in Tavernier. But you can see it says here, Ground Observation Corps, guard our country. And observers would just simply sit up in this tower and scan the horizon out over the water, looking for enemy action. And again, if they saw anything, they would report it. And then you had what was called the picket fleet, or the hooligan navy, and that was really a variety of vessels, privately owned vessels, that were put into government service. They carried on with their normal business, but they were often given radio equipment and fuel and those sorts of things by the government. And as they did their business, they kept an eye out. So we see the schooner Western Union involved in that picket fleet, as was the turtle schooner Adams, which sailed between here and Nicaragua. So all of these vessels out there on the water, keeping an eye out for enemy submarines. I cannot tell this story without addressing Ernest Hemingway's efforts. He was also part of the hooligan navy. And it's kind of an interesting, crazy story, but in the summer of 1942, becoming clear that there are a lot of U-boats in the area attacking ships, and Hemingway, always searching for adventure, went to Washington, approached the Navy and the Office of National Intelligence about a plan he had conceived to use his fishing boat, Pilar, to search for Nazi submarines. He thought that in his plan, he could cruise the Florida Straits if the government would then give him Thompson submachine guns and grenades. He could get up close to these, because the Pilar was just sort of an innocuous fishing boat. He could get up close to the submarines and then attack them. Of course, that plan was completely harebrained, wishful thinking at best, but the folks in D.C. thought, well, crazy as it is, if Hemingway can pull off even some of this, it would be great PR and a huge boost to stateside morale. So they approved the plan. They assigned a Marine to the Pilar. They gave him communications gear. They gave him fuel for his boat, and they gave him all the Thompson submachine guns and grenades, and off he went. And for the next 1.5 years, he and his friends and his sons, cruised the Florida Straits looking for submarines. I think they were doing a lot of fishing too. But anyway, they did see one U-boat. It was about 6 miles away from them, so they never got close to it. By the time they tried to approach it, it had submerged. And then by January of 1944, Hemingway realized that, okay, it's over. There were subs had faded away. So he put Pilar into dry dock and replaced its engine. He had run it so hard. Anyway, we'll go back to 1942. The attacks keep coming. In August of 1942, we see a very interesting and honestly suspicious attack that occurred south of Key West, possibly a case of espionage, we don't know. But this involved 7 merchant vessels, which were escorted by 2 Navy craft, steaming out of Key West Harbor. And the group was organized to deliver newly developed radio equipment for an advanced base somewhere to the south, probably in Cuba. The classified equipment was put on the 2 oldest and slowest vessels of the group. Those were the Cuban freighters Manzanillo and Santiago de Cuba, and they were then positioned in the center of the convoy. The thought was, okay, these are the old, sort of decrepit vessels. The Nazis aren't going to go for them. They're going to go for the nicer, newer ships. But no, they got 15 miles south of Key West, and Manzanillo and Santiago de Cuba were singled out, torpedoed, and both of them were sunk. The rest of the ships made it safely to Havana. Of course, there were fears that because they were singled out like that, it was a targeted attack and that somebody on the U-boat had been given information about them. But there was an investigation done. They could never find any evidence of espionage. So certainly a suspicious attack, but whether it was truly espionage or not is not known. Now we see this chart. This shows you the activities in 1942 in this greater area, sort of the Gulf Sea frontier of Florida, Cuba, and the greater Keys area. And you see the number of attacks are just astronomical in May, tapering off in June, and then by August, when the Cuban freighters were attacked, it's really coming down to nothing, because what the Navy had learned was that this convoy system was really, really effective, and you see the results right there. So that didn't end the U-boat attacks. The Germans kept up the pressure. They didn't want the Americans to feel comfortable over here. And they didn't want them to think that they could pour all their resources into the European campaign. They wanted to keep our Navy engaged here stateside, and so they kept sending U-boats across and attacking and forcing the U.S. to stay engaged on this side of the Atlantic. In April 3rd of 1943, we see another attack in the Keys. This time the SS Gulf State, the 6,800-ton tanker, was sunk 40 miles southeast of Islamorada by the U-155. The Gulf State was struck by 2 torpedoes and it sank in 4 minutes. Lifeboats on the vessel burned, and they couldn't be deployed. So the 61 men on board were forced to swim through a 600-foot burning ring of oil around the ship. Out of those 61 men, 43 of them died. Those who survived could only cling to flotsam for hours before they were rescued. And this is just such a touching photograph here. This is the moment those men were spied by the U.S. Navy, and they began rescue operations. But you can see they're just hanging on to any bit of floating stuff that they could find from their ship. Really a powerful photo. In July of 1943, we see the last U-boat engagement in the Florida Keys, and this is a wild story. On the evening of July 18th, 1943, the 250-foot-long helium-filled Navy blimp K-74 left Naval Air Station Richmond for anti-submarine patrol over the Florida Straits. The Navy station that it left from is now where Miami Zoo is. All right? So if you've ever been there, that used to be a naval station. The blimp was under the command of Lieutenant Nelson G. Grills. Near midnight, the blimp made a radar contact, and they decided to pursue that contact. And on approach, they could see from the blimp that it was clearly a U-boat cruising on the surface. And though it was unorthodox for a blimp to engage with a submarine, the U-134 was heading towards a tanker and a freighter, which were just a few miles away. Grills saw that those two vessels were going to be the next victims of the U-134. So he decided he had no choice but to attack. The blimp approached from behind, and when they were 250 yards away, they opened fire. That caused some damage to the U-134, but it also alerted the Germans that, hey, there's something attacking us. So they came pouring out onto the deck. They returned fire with their guns, and both vessels were damaged in the engagement. The K-74 attempted to drop depth charges, but the bomb release jammed, and the charges did not fall from the blimp. Wound up that the blimp's envelope was punctured by the U-134's gunfire, and its starboard engine was destroyed. The airship was sinking out of the sky, and it was uncontrollable, and it eventually went into the water. Most of the men stayed with the blimp as long as they could until it sank 8 hours later. Lieutenant Grills thought, well, maybe he could swim to the Keys, so he set out, paddling away, trying to reach somewhere in the Keys here. But eventually, all the men were rescued, with the exception of one man who was eaten by a shark. Now, interesting afternote to this, a couple interesting afternotes. The U-134 surfaced after the attack. They had dived down. They came back up, and they returned to the site of the blimp, and they actually salvaged items from it. The men on the blimp had no idea that this happened. They swore they didn't see any evidence of the U-134. But it was known to be a fact because the men on the U-134 took photographs of their activities. And that film was eventually delivered to one of their milk cow refueling vessels and taken on to Germany, and the photographs wound up in an archive where they were found many years later. There you are. These are the Germans salvaging the blimp and the blimp in the water there. There was a debate in the Navy as to whether or not the K-74 crew had acted properly, and there were consideration of court-martialing Lieutenant Grills. But vindication came later. The U-134, once it crossed the Atlantic back to Europe, was sunk in the Bay of Biscay by the British. And it was sunk because it was unable to dive because of damage inflicted by the K-74. So, in 1961, Lieutenant Grills was awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross for his role in the kill of the U-134. So it took a while, but he was honored for his actions. Wonderful little graphic that comes from a 1945 Key West citizen when they could finally open up and talk about everything that had happened. And this is a map showing all the various attacks by U-boats during the course of the war. You can see they all happened in 1942 and 1943. The dots were 1942. The X's are 1943. Some of them, I think, maybe are a little fanciful. I can find absolutely no evidence for U-boats operating north of Key West here. But anyway, it does give you a sense of the distribution of these attacks. Now, these attacks don't mean sinkings. They mean attacks. A U-boat tried to engage with an Allied vessel. So it just shows you how significant the Keys were as a battlefront in World War II. Of course, May of 1945, Victory in Europe Day. Germany, after it surrendered, was forced to give up all of its U-boats. After the war, these U-boats were seized. We see a number of them here. I'm not sure where these are. These may be in Portsmouth. They had been delivered across the Atlantic. But anyway, we see the U-2513, the U-3008, and the U-505. All of those U-boats wound up in the Florida Keys. And these two were quite the prize. These were both brand new U-boats. They were what was called Type 21 U-boats. They were all electric. They were the latest design. They could go deeper, faster, and farther than any other submarine in existence. And the U.S. Navy was thrilled to have them in their possession so they could dissect them and figure out what made them tick. The first of them, the U-505, like I said, wound up in Key West. Came here in December of 1945. Much like we saw in 1919, it was part of a Victory Long drive. Came here, was docked down on the waterfront, right in front of what's the old administration building there on the Navy base. And locals, residents of the town, could go and tour the 505, and hopefully they would drop some money in the kitty and, again, help reduce war debt. It's funny. I have actually been on the U-505, and I'm going to guess that a few of you in here as well have been on the U-505. If you have ever been to the Museum of Science and Industry in Chicago, they have a submarine exhibit, and you can go tour through the submarine. Well, that submarine is the U-505. And it's a wonderful thing. I remember being on there as a kid. It was fantastic, and I think I would appreciate it even more today. But anyway, it is available if you're ever in Chicago. Worth checking out. The U-3008 was brought to Key West in 1947. It was here a couple of times. It arrived first in April of 47 for duty involving the development of submarine and anti-submarine warfare. It was here until October, went up north for a few months, and then returned to Key West in March of 1948. It was employed with the Operational Development Force until June, went north again, and then where it was used as a training hulk and eventually scrapped in 1956. The U-2513 has a more impressive Keys presence. It was brought here in the fall of 1946. This was taken on October 30th, probably very shortly after it arrived here. You can see a beautiful vessel. Now, Harry Truman came to Key West for the first time in November of 1946, and somebody had the bright idea that it would be fun to take President Truman on the U-2513 for a ride. So he did. President Truman, on November 21st, 1946, joined by his aides, other staff, and various military brass, all got onto the U-2513, went out past the reef off Key West into about 1,000 feet of water, and they dove to a depth of 440 feet, and they remained submerged for 44 minutes. Truman hanging out in the control room, probably loving every minute of it. As they were surfacing, an engine flooded, and it sent smoke into one of the battery rooms and caused some alarm, but they managed to surface safely. And then a planned anti-submarine exercise was performed, with artillery fire and depth charges dropped within 2,000 yards of the president on the submarine. I don't know how they got away with that. What is even more amazing is you have to remember, in Truman's first term, he had no vice president. So if something had happened, who would be in charge? Anyway, by 1951, the U-2513 had outlived its usefulness, and on October 7th, of 51, it was sunk in rocket tests by a U.S. Navy destroyer off the Dry Tortugas, where it has rested ever since. Sometime in the 2010s, a group called Nautilus Live, run by the Ocean Education Trust, visited the wreck, photographed it, videotaped it, and mapped it, and this is what it looks like today. Now, the victims of these U-boats were largely tankers, carrying petroleum products, oil and fuel and all of that, and when they sink, they take that fuel with them. Well, NOAA has a growing fear that these victims of the U-boats are someday going to open up and spill out their contents. And so, whether that's through just decay or a hurricane or whatever. So they have done assessments of the various vessels that they can identify through the historical record, even if they know exactly where they are or not, and put forth risk assessment reports about each one of them. Here, this one's for the Norlindo, which was sunk by the U-507, the first victim in the Gulf of Mexico. But this is their scenario, that if the Norlindo opened up, what would happen to all the oil on board? Well, there are definitely vessels out there, and people, know where some of them are. This one is supposedly the Munger T. Ball, but you can see for years it's been called the oil wreck. It's out past the Tortugas, and oil just burbling to the surface, creating a sheen. So NOAA, the Navy, and a group called Resolve Marine banded together and decided to pump out this shipwreck. And so in 2021, they went out to the oil wreck, the supposed Munger T. Ball, and pumped out 35,000 gallons of fuel. But even with that one success, these vessels, there are so many of them, these wrecks, are going to be a persistent issue for the foreseeable future. So, as we can see on this map, the waters of the Florida Keys were a significant frontier in Operation Drumbeat and the Battle of the Atlantic and the Battle of the Gulf of Mexico. Though they might not be well remembered, German U-boats affected the entirety of our island chain. And the stories are not just distant memories. At every one of these sites, there are physical reminders of the oceanic battlefront, and they remain with us today. With that, there is much more to learn. That's it. I thank you.